Grace was just a poor orphan girl, treated like a servant in her own home. Every day she worked from sunrise to midnight, while her cruel stepmother reminded her she was worthless. One night, that same stepmother almost ended her life while she slept. But fate had other plans, because just days later, something unbelievable happened in the market. A luxury car crashed. Inside was a young man bleeding and dying, and while everyone else stood and watched, only Grace ran to save him. What she didn't know was that the man she saved was the son of one of the most powerful billionaires in the country, and months later, that one moment of kindness would return and shock everyone who ever looked down on her. Before the sun even thought about rising, Grace Miller was already awake. The small house was silent except for the soft sound of her footsteps on the cold floor. Outside, the sky was still dark, and the air carried the quiet chill of early morning. Grace wrapped her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped outside with the bucket in her hand. Another long day had begun. For most girls her age, mornings meant preparing for school or sharing breakfast with family, but for Grace, mornings meant work, endless work. After her father died 3 years ago, everything in her life changed. The man who once protected her from the harshness of the world was gone, and the woman he left behind, her stepmother Margaret Stone, had never truly loved her. At first, Margaret pretended to care, but as time passed, the mask slowly disappeared. Now Grace was no longer treated like a daughter, she was treated like a servant. Grace walked nearly a mile to the village well. The bucket felt heavy as she carried it back, but she didn't complain. She had learned long ago that complaining only made things worse. By the time she returned, the sky had begun to glow with soft orange light, but Margaret was already awake and already angry. "You're late again," Margaret shouted from the doorway. Grace quickly lowered her head. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Margaret snatched the bucket from her hands. "Sorry doesn't cook food. Sorry doesn't clean this house." Grace hurried inside and began sweeping the dusty floor. The small house wasn't big, but Margaret made sure every corner shined. After sweeping came washing clothes. After washing clothes came cooking breakfast. After breakfast came more chores. And once the morning work was done, Margaret handed Grace a basket filled with fruits. "Take these to the market," she ordered. "Don't come back until everything is sold." Grace nodded quietly. The basket was heavy, but she lifted it onto her head and began the long walk to the busy market. The sun climbed higher into the sky as the streets slowly filled with people. The market soon became alive with voices, vendors shouting, children laughing, buyers arguing over prices. Grace found her usual spot near a dusty roadside. She gently placed the basket down and began arranging the fruits neatly. "Fresh fruits," she called softly. Her voice wasn't loud like the other sellers, but people often stopped anyway. Maybe it was her kindness, or maybe it was the quiet sadness in her eyes. Hour after hour passed. The hot sun burned against her skin, but Grace stayed patient. Every coin she earned would go straight to Margaret. Still, she smiled at every customer. By late afternoon, the basket was finally empty. Grace wiped sweat from her forehead and counted the small pile of coins in her hand. It wasn't much, but she hoped it would be enough to keep Margaret from shouting tonight. As the sky slowly turned orange again, Grace began the long walk home. Her legs were tired, her back ached, but she kept walking. When she finally reached the house, Margaret was waiting at the door. Her sharp eyes immediately looked at the coins in Grace's hand. "That's all?" she snapped. Grace lowered her head. "Yes, the market was slow today." Margaret scoffed. "Useless girl." She snatched the coins from Grace's hand and turned away. Grace quietly stepped inside. Dinner was already on the table. Margaret and her son ate first. Grace waited in the corner. Only after they finished was she allowed to eat the small leftovers. That night, after washing the dishes and cleaning the kitchen, Grace finally laid down on her thin mat. Her body felt exhausted. Her stomach was still half hungry, but she closed her eyes and whispered softly into the darkness, "God, please don't forget about me." A single tear slipped down her cheek. Outside, the night wind moved gently through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, fate was already preparing the moment that would change Grace's life forever. But Grace didn't know that yet. All she knew was that tomorrow, another difficult day would begin. That night, the small house was quiet. Outside, the wind moved gently through the palm trees, making soft whispering sounds in the darkness. Inside the house, the dim yellow light of a small kerosene lamp flickered on the wall. Grace moved slowly around the kitchen area, washing the last of the dishes. Her hands were tired. Her back ached from the long day at the market. But she didn't complain. She had learned long ago that silence was safer. Margaret sat in the other room, leaning back in a plastic chair, chewing loudly while watching Grace work. Her eyes followed every movement Grace made. Finally, Grace finished washing the dishes and wiped her hands on her old dress. "May I sleep now?" she asked quietly. Margaret looked at her with cold eyes. "You people like sleep too much," she snapped. Grace lowered her head. "I'm sorry." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "Just go." Grace quickly spread her thin mat on the floor near the kitchen wall. It was the only place she was allowed to sleep. She lay down slowly, her body exhausted. Within minutes, sleep began to pull her into darkness. But Margaret was still awake, and tonight, something dark was growing in her heart. She stood up slowly and walked into the kitchen. Her eyes fell on the metal cooking pot sitting on the stove. An evil idea formed in her mind. Margaret picked up the pot and filled it with water. Then she placed it over the fire. The flames grew stronger beneath it. The water slowly began to heat. Margaret stood there watching it carefully. Her face was hard, cold, cruel. "Let me see how she will continue to be useless after tonight," she muttered under her breath. Minutes passed. Soon the water began to bubble. Then it started to boil. Hot steam rose into the air. Margaret wrapped a cloth around the handle of the pot and lifted it carefully. The boiling water inside moved violently. She slowly turned and looked toward the kitchen corner. Grace was sleeping peacefully on the mat. Her face looked calm for the first time that day. Margaret walked quietly toward her. Step by step, her shadow moved across the wall. The pot trembled slightly in her hands. She stood over Grace. For a moment she stared down at the sleeping girl. Then she slowly began lifting the pot higher. Just as she prepared to pour the boiling water, boom! A loud thunder cracked across the sky. The sudden sound shook the house. At the same moment, the electricity went out. The room was thrown into complete darkness. Margaret panicked. Her foot slipped on the dusty floor. The pot tilted violently in her hands. The boiling water spilled out. But not on Grace. It splashed across the kitchen floor instead. Margaret screamed as the hot water nearly touched her feet. The loud noise woke Grace instantly. She jumped up in fear. "What happened?" she cried. The room was dark. Margaret quickly dropped the empty pot and stepped back, breathing heavily. Her heart was pounding. Grace lit the kerosene lamp with trembling hands. The small flame slowly illuminated the room. Grace looked around in confusion. The floor was wet. The empty pot was lying on its side. Margaret stood nearby, her face tense. "What happened?" Grace asked again. Margaret quickly forced an angry expression onto her face. "Are you blind?" she snapped. "The pot fell while I was boiling water." Grace looked worried. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear anything." Margaret turned away quickly. "Just clean the floor and go back to sleep." Grace nodded nervously and grabbed a rag. As she wiped the hot water from the floor, she felt something strange in her heart. She didn't know why, but it felt like she had just escaped something terrible. When the floor was dry again, Grace returned to her mat. She lay down quietly, but sleep did not come easily. Outside, the storm continued rumbling across the sky, and somewhere deep in the darkness, fate was still moving silently toward her. Grace didn't know it yet, but very soon, her life was about to change forever. The morning sun rose bright over the village, but Grace Miller didn't notice it. Her body ached from the night before. Every muscle felt heavy, yet she had no choice. Margaret would not allow her to rest. She packed her worn basket with the few fruits left for sale, wrapping them carefully in old cloth to protect them from the heat. Her dress was faded and torn in places, but her spirit, though tired, remained gentle and determined. She stepped into the dusty road that led to the market. The streets were already bustling. Men shouted their wares. Children ran between stalls, laughing and dodging carts. The smell of roasted corn, grilled fish, and fresh produce filled the air. Grace adjusted the basket on her head, trying to smile politely at passing customers, her eyes scanning for anyone who might buy something. Hours passed slowly. Sweat dripped down her forehead. Customers came and went. Each coin she earned felt like a small victory, though she knew it would all be claimed by Margaret. Grace didn't complain. She had learned that kindness and patience were her only weapons in this world. Then, around midday, chaos erupted. A loud screech of tires echoed through the market. People froze mid-step. A luxury black car had lost control, swerving violently along the narrow street. Vendors screamed and tried to pull back their stalls. Fruits and baskets were knocked over. Dust and smoke filled the air. Grace's heart raced as she froze for a split second. Then she saw him. A young man had been thrown violently from the car. His suit, once pristine, was torn and stained with dirt and blood. His forehead bled from a deep cut. His body lay awkwardly on the dusty ground, half-conscious, barely moving. People around whispered and stepped back. Some pointed, others murmured, "Call the police." But no one dared touch him. Grace didn't think. Her heart pounded. Without a second thought, she dropped her basket and ran. She pushed through the crowd, dodging overturned fruits, broken wood, and startled children. Her hands trembled as she reached him. His eyes fluttered weakly open, panic and pain mixed in his gaze. Grace could see how close he was to slipping away. "Please, you have to be okay," she whispered, pressing a piece of cloth against his bleeding forehead. Her voice shook, but her hands were steady. Sweat dripped from both their faces. The heat of the sun was unbearable, but she didn't care. She tried to stabilize him, gently checking his breathing, murmuring encouragement, telling him to hold on. Nearby, a motorcycle rider stopped. Grace waved frantically, gesturing for help. The rider nodded and quickly lifted the young man onto the bike. Grace held onto his arm as they sped toward the nearest small hospital. Inside, nurses immediately took over. Grace stayed by the bedside until the doctors began treatment. "Are you his sister?" a nurse asked. Grace shook her head. "No, he just needs someone," she said softly. Hours later, the young man was stable, but Grace had no time to rest. She quietly left the hospital, her heart still racing from the near tragedy. She didn't know his name, she didn't know who he was, but somehow, deep inside, she felt as though her life and his had been tied together by fate that day. And somewhere far away in a tall, luxurious office in the city, Daniel Carter's father, a wealthy and powerful man, had already begun to feel the ripple of the event that would change everything. Grace didn't know it yet, but her small act of courage and kindness had set into motion a chain of events that would soon shock everyone she had ever known and change her life forever. Days passed after the accident. Grace Miller returned to her usual routine, selling fruits at the market, walking miles under the hot Nigerian sun, and returning home to a house full of chores. Yet something had changed inside her heart. That day, as she held the young man's bleeding body in her arms, something unexplainable had awakened. A feeling that saving a life was worth every danger she faced. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter lay in a small hospital bed, unconscious for the first few hours. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple hospital gown. Nurses worked tirelessly to clean his wounds and stabilize his condition. The deep cut on his forehead had been patched, but the bruises and scratches all over his body told a story of chaos. The doctors were clear, he had survived, but only because someone brave, had acted quickly before anyone else did. And that person was Grace Miller, though Daniel had yet to see her face again. When Daniel finally woke, he felt a strange mixture of relief and frustration. His first words were slurred, weak. Who? A nurse looked at him. "Don't worry, you're safe now. A kind girl helped you. She stayed until we got you here." Daniel's mind raced. He tried to imagine the person who had saved him, the hands that had stopped the bleeding, the courage that had faced chaos while everyone else stood by. He asked repeatedly for her name. The nurse only smiled. "None of us know. She left after making sure you were okay." Daniel couldn't stop thinking about her. Every detail, every second replayed in his mind. The soft urgency in her voice, the strength in her trembling hands, the fear in her wide brown eyes. Who was this girl? Where had she gone? Back in the village, Grace sold fruits with her usual gentle smile, unaware that the young man she had saved was alive. She did not know who he was, nor did she care. Her heart was simple. She helped because it was right, because leaving someone to die was not an option for her. But fate, as it always does, had plans that neither of them could foresee. Days turned into weeks. Daniel's family had already been informed of the accident. His father, Richard Carter, one of the richest men in the country, was furious, not at Daniel, but at the thought that his son had been so close to death. Yet he could not stop thinking about the girl who had saved him. Daniel, slowly recovering in the hospital, found himself searching for Grace in his mind constantly. He began asking nurses and doctors if anyone had seen her again. No one could tell him. At night he would stare at the ceiling of his hospital room, imagining the scene, the dust-filled streets, the overturned fruit baskets, the frightened villagers who had done nothing, and the brave girl who had acted when no one else would. He felt a strange admiration growing inside him, not for his own life, not for the luxurious hospitals or his family wealth, but for the courage of someone he didn't even know. And somewhere far away, Grace whispered quietly in her small room one night, exhausted after her chores, "God, I hope he is safe." Neither knew that their paths were already intertwined, that a single act of courage had set in motion a chain of events that would soon change both their lives forever. Fate, silent and patient, had begun to weave its threads. And soon Daniel would see Grace again, this time under circumstances neither of them could have imagined. The market was alive with noise and colors once more. Grace Miller moved through the crowded Nigerian street, carrying her empty basket after selling the last of her fruits. Sweat glistened on her forehead, but she smiled politely at the few remaining customers, adjusting the faded brown dress she had worn for weeks. Life was hard, but she had learned to find small moments of peace in the chaos. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter had finally been discharged from the hospital. His injuries were healing, but his mind was restless. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl who had saved him. He had asked his driver to bring him to the village market, not because he needed fruits, not because he wanted to shop, but because he needed answers. As he stepped out of the sleek black car, the contrast between his expensive suit, polished shoes, and the dusty, colorful market was glaring. Vendors and shoppers whispered as they recognized him. Daniel's tall frame, confident posture, and city presence stood out sharply. Yet all he could see was the one person he had never met properly but couldn't forget. Grace was kneeling beside a small pile of fruits, arranging them neatly, when she felt a sudden change in the crowd's energy. She looked up briefly and froze. A tall, well-dressed young man was staring straight at her. His eyes were intense but gentle, scanning her face as if trying to remember every detail. Grace's heart skipped a beat. Something about him felt familiar, but she shook her head. "Excuse me," Daniel called softly, his voice calm but firm. "Did you help someone here a few days ago? A man who was injured?" Grace's eyes widened. She looked at him carefully, noticing the sharp features, the elegant suit, and the faint scars on his hands. She had a small moment of hesitation, unsure if she should speak. "Yes," she said quietly. "I helped him. He's okay now, right?" Her voice trembled slightly, a mix of curiosity and caution. Daniel's lips curved into a small smile. Relief and admiration flooded his eyes. "Yes, he is. You saved him. I've been trying to find you ever since." Grace blushed. She had never been praised like this before. Her life had been filled with chores, abuse, and struggles. Yet this moment, this simple recognition, felt unreal. The crowd around them seemed to fade into the background. The market's noise, the shouting vendors, the dusty stalls, all of it disappeared as their eyes met. Daniel stepped closer, carefully, not wanting to frighten her. I needed to thank you personally. My name is Daniel. Grace swallowed hard, feeling a strange warmth in her chest. I'm Grace, she said softly. They stood in silence for a moment, the world around them moving, but neither noticing. Then a little boy ran past, knocking over a basket of fruits near Grace. Both of them jumped slightly, breaking the spell, and Grace hurried to clean up. Daniel watched her, noticing the strength, care, and humility in her movements. He realized something deep inside. This girl, this poor, humble girl, was extraordinary. And Grace, though still unsure who he really was, felt a flicker of something she had never experienced before. Interest, curiosity, perhaps even trust. From that day, Daniel's visits to the market became frequent. He never forced attention on her, never spoke too much. But every glance, every subtle act, built a connection neither of them could explain. For Grace, it was strange and new. For Daniel, it was impossible to ignore. And somewhere deep in both their hearts, the threads of fate were pulling them closer, stronger than either of them had realized. Little did they know, their lives were about to change forever, and the bond that began that day would face challenges, secrets, and choices that could either unite them or tear them apart. Days passed, and the market became a place where Grace's life intersected with Daniel's more than she could have imagined. Each morning, Grace carried her basket through the dusty Nigerian streets, arranging fruits and vegetables with her usual patience. Sweat glistened on her forehead, hair slightly messy from the morning work, but her smile remained gentle, humble, and inviting to those who bought from her. Daniel, meanwhile, had returned to the village frequently, not to shop, but to see her. He wore his crisp city clothes, shoes polished, suit neatly pressed, yet he moved carefully among the crowded stalls, respecting her space. Their encounters were small at first, a shared glance as she handed him a pineapple, a quiet hello as she adjusted a basket, a smile exchange when a passerby bumped into her. These tiny moments were the start of something neither of them fully understood. One afternoon, the sun was high, casting long shadows across the busy market. Grace had sold most of her fruits and was preparing to pack up when she noticed Daniel standing nearby, watching her quietly, a small smile on his face. "Good afternoon, Grace," he said softly, stepping closer but keeping respectful distance. "Good afternoon," she replied, her cheeks warming slightly, heart fluttering. She tried to continue arranging her fruits, pretending nothing special was happening. I wanted to see how you were doing," Daniel said, eyes honest and curious. After everything that happened, I wanted to thank you again." Grace lowered her gaze. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her basket. "It was nothing. I just did what anyone should do," she whispered. Daniel chuckled softly, a warm, gentle sound, and his eyes never left hers. There was admiration there, and something deeper, a feeling he didn't yet have the words to describe. For Grace, it was strange. She had never been noticed in this way before. She had survived harsh words, long days of labor and cruelty at home, but this, someone genuinely caring for her, felt almost unreal. Her cheeks tingled, and a small smile broke across her face. Days turned into weeks. Daniel would sometimes bring a small gift, like fresh fruit or a bottle of water, leaving it near her stall with a polite smile. Grace would glance at it, unsure, her face a mix of curiosity, gratitude, and hesitation. They never spoke of wealth, status, or the vast differences in their lives. In these moments, none of that mattered. It was simply a boy and a girl, bound by an act of courage, slowly learning to care for one another. And even as their bond grew, neither of them knew how the world around them would react: the gossiping villagers, the stepmother still plotting, and the powerful Carter family who would soon take notice. One evening, as the market quieted and the sun dipped low, Daniel lingered a little longer, watching Grace carefully pack her basket. "You are very brave," he said softly. Grace paused, looking up at him, eyes wide. "Brave? I don't know," she murmured. "I just do what I must." Daniel smiled a little wistfully, as if he understood more than she could ever imagine. "No, you're extraordinary, and one day everyone will see it too." Grace's heart fluttered. She looked down at her basket, cheeks warm, silently wishing she could know what he truly meant. Fate had begun to weave a stronger thread between them, a bond built on courage, admiration, and the quiet beginnings of love. But little did they know, the coming days would test that bond in ways neither could imagine. And so their story continued, closer than ever, yet still full of challenges, secrets, and suspense. The market casting long shadows across the dusty Nigerian streets. Grace Miller had nearly finished arranging her fruits for the day. Her hands were calloused, her brown dress faded and worn, but her posture remained proud, strong, and dignified. Daniel Carter stood a few steps away, observing quietly as always. But today was different. Today, he had decided to speak more openly, to learn about her life, to understand the girl whose courage had saved his life. "Grace," he called softly, stepping closer. His suit glistened in the sunlight, his shoes dusted slightly from the market's dirt roads. "May I sit with you for a moment?" Grace hesitated, her brown eyes wide with caution, but there was something in Daniel's tone, a gentleness, a respect, that made her nod. He lowered himself onto a nearby wooden crate, careful not to crowd her. "I've been thinking," he said, voice calm but intense, "about that day, the accident. I can't stop wondering how someone like you could risk everything for a stranger." Grace lowered her gaze, fingers brushing over the faded fruits in her basket. Her voice was quiet but firm. "It wasn't bravery. I couldn't leave someone to die. Anyone else would have done the same." Daniel shook his head slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "No, not anyone. Most people ran away. You stayed. You helped me when no one else would. That makes you extraordinary." Grace's cheeks warmed. She glanced up, catching his eyes. There was a flicker of admiration in them, mixed with curiosity and something deeper. Why are you here, really?" she asked cautiously, tone soft but wary. "Are you looking for something?" Daniel leaned back slightly, considering his words. I'm trying to understand you, your world, your life, what makes you strong. I know I come from a different place, a different world, but I need to know you." Grace's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever looked at her like this, not even her own family. Her stepmother's cruel words echoed faintly in her mind, but here, in this moment, there was warmth, respect, and curiosity from someone she had saved. I don't know if I'm worth understanding," she whispered, unsure. Daniel shook his head again, more firmly this time. "You are, and I want to, because you matter." For a moment the market faded away, the shouting vendors, the dusty streets, the bustling villages. There was only Grace and Daniel, two souls connected by fate and courage. A small breeze rustled the nearby umbrellas, carrying the scent of fresh fruits and baked goods. Grace smiled faintly, her heart fluttering. From that day, their conversations grew longer, deeper. Daniel asked carefully about her life, her struggles, her dreams. Grace, in turn, spoke cautiously, revealing glimpses of her world, the chores, the hard labor, the harsh words from her stepmother. Yet with each exchange, a bond grew, built on trust, respect, and quiet admiration. Neither spoke of wealth or status. It didn't matter. In those moments, they were simply two young hearts learning to care, learning to understand, learning to trust. And deep down, both knew this connection was rare, precious, and fragile. Fate had intertwined their lives in ways that could not be undone, But neither of them knew how many challenges awaited, how the outside world, their families and harsh realities could test the courage and love they were slowly beginning to feel. Still, in the quiet market that afternoon, with the sun dipping low, Grace and Daniel sat together, talking, laughing softly, and beginning a journey that neither would forget. The Nigerian market buzzed with life, the midday sun casting warm light over colorful stalls and dusty streets. Grace Miller moved gracefully among her fruits, arranging them carefully for the few customers that passed by. Her brown dress, faded and worn, clung to her from the morning's sweat, but her eyes were bright, alert, and full of life. Daniel Carter, as always, lingered nearby. Today he had decided to spend more time with her, not just brief greetings or small gestures, but a real conversation. His polished shoes kicked up tiny clouds of dust as he approached, a soft smile playing on his lips, eyes gentle yet attentive. "Grace," he called softly, careful not to startle her. "May I sit again?" Grace paused, feeling a familiar flutter in her chest. Her cheeks warmed slightly. "Yes, of course," she whispered. He lowered himself carefully onto a nearby wooden crate. "I wanted to know more about you," he said, voice calm but full of curiosity. "About your life, your dreams, even your fears." Grace's gaze fell to her hands, brushing over the fruits in her basket. "Dreams?" she murmured. I've never really had time to dream. Every day is work, chores, survival, and my stepmother doesn't make it any easier." Her eyes flicked briefly to Daniel, searching his expression for judgment or pity. She found none, only gentle curiosity and understanding. Daniel shook his head slowly, smiling faintly. "I don't want to pity you. I want to understand you. You're extraordinary. The way you care for others, your courage. It's remarkable." Grace blinked, a faint tear forming at the corner of her eye. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. "I'm not extraordinary," she whispered, voice trembling slightly. "I just do what I can." Daniel reached out subtly, just enough for her to notice, but not to touch. "No, Grace, you are, and I think one day everyone will see that too." For a moment, the bustling market faded into the background. There was only Grace and Daniel and the silent connection growing between them. The warmth of the sun, the soft rustling of nearby umbrellas, the distant chatter of vendors. All of it seemed muted in the intensity of that moment. But as always, life had its shadows. From across the street, a figure watched them closely. Grace's stepmother, her face twisted with jealousy, suspicion, and anger. She had noticed Daniel lingering near Grace more often, leaving gifts, speaking kindly, and creating a bond that threatened her control over Grace. The woman's lips curled into a small, cruel smile. "So, you think you're special, girl?" she muttered under her breath, fists clenched. Meanwhile, Daniel and Grace continued their conversation, unaware of the watchful eyes plotting nearby. They spoke of dreams, small hopes for the future, and the simple pleasures they rarely allowed themselves to enjoy. "You really care," Grace said softly, finally looking up at him fully. "Even for someone like me, you care." Daniel's eyes softened. "I do, and I will, no matter what." Grace felt a flutter in her chest, a mix of curiosity, trust, and something new, something like hope. As the market slowly emptied and the sun began its descent, casting golden light over the dusty streets, Daniel and Grace packed up her stall together, their hands brushing occasionally, creating sparks of connection neither could ignore. Little did they know, their growing closeness had already sparked envy and danger. The shadows of Grace's stepmother, the gossiping villagers, and the unknown pressures of Daniel's wealthy world were slowly closing in, and soon this bond, fragile yet beautiful, would face its first true test. The Nigerian market was quieter than usual, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows over the dusty streets. Grace Miller was finishing her day, arranging the last of her fruits. Sweat dampened her faded brown dress, hair slightly disheveled from a long day of work. Her stepmother's harsh words echoed faintly in her mind, making her heart heavy. Daniel Carter arrived as usual, crisp suit slightly dusty from walking the market streets. He smiled gently as he approached, eyes scanning for Grace first. He noticed her tired expression and the subtle worry in her eyes. "Grace," he called softly, stepping closer, careful not to startle her. "Are you okay?" Grace looked up, blinking, trying to hide the tension in her face. "I'm managing," she replied quietly, forcing a small smile. Daniel's expression softened. "I wish I could make it easier for you." His voice was calm, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made Grace look down, cheeks warming. Just then, Grace's stepmother appeared from a nearby alley, arms crossed, face twisted with anger and jealousy. Her eyes glinted with malice as she watched the interaction between Daniel and Grace. "You think he's special, don't you?" her stepmother muttered under her breath, a cruel smile tugging at her lips. "No one will take my control from me." Daniel noticed the woman for the first time, his jaw tightening slightly. "Grace, ignore her," he said softly, his tone protective but calm. Grace hesitated, eyes darting between Daniel and her stepmother. She felt the familiar fear and anxiety that had plagued her all her life. It's okay," she murmured, voice trembling. Daniel reached subtly for her hand, not touching, but close enough to convey reassurance. Grace felt a strange warmth, a flutter in her chest, but she quickly pulled back slightly. "Grace," Daniel said quietly, voice serious, I don't want anyone to hurt you, ever." Grace's lips trembled and she looked away, trying to hide the rising emotions. I'm not used to someone caring like this," she whispered. Daniel's eyes softened, filled with sincerity and admiration. "Then let me care. Let me protect you. You deserve it." Meanwhile, the stepmother's expression darkened further. She whispered to a nearby villager, "We'll see how long this lasts. That boy doesn't know what he's dealing with." Grace felt a mixture of fear, gratitude, and confusion. She wanted to trust Daniel, wanted to lean on him, but the shadows of her past, her stepmother's cruelty, and the whispers of the villagers weighed heavily on her heart. As the sun dipped lower, painting the market in shades of orange and gold, Daniel and Grace packed up the stall together. Their hands brushed, accidentally, an electric, fleeting spark. Both of them froze, eyes meeting for a brief moment, emotions unspoken but deeply felt. I should go," Grace whispered, trying to regain composure. Daniel nodded, expression soft but concerned. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised, his gaze lingering on her. "I'll always be around." Grace walked home slowly, heart racing, a mix of hope and fear swirling inside her. She knew one thing for certain: Daniel was different. He saw her bravery, her heart, her worth, but she also knew that her stepmother, the villagers, and the cruel realities of life could threaten the fragile bond forming between them. And somewhere deep in her heart she realized that love and courage would soon be tested like never before. The sun rose slowly over the bustling Nigerian village, casting long golden rays across dusty streets and colorful market stalls. Grace Miller had started her day early, her brown dress faded and worn, hair tied loosely. She carried her basket filled with fruits, already weary from a day that promised more labor and chores. But today felt different. There was a tension in the air, subtle yet unmissable. Her stepmother had been unusually quiet, watching her with thinly veiled malice. As Grace arranged her fruits, she noticed Daniel Carter approaching from the far end of the market. His polished shoes kicked up tiny dust clouds, his crisp suit gleaming under the morning sun. His eyes immediately sought hers. "Grace," he called softly, stepping closer, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I need to talk to you. Somewhere quiet." Grace's heart fluttered. She nodded slightly, following him to a secluded corner behind a market stall, away from curious eyes. Daniel's expression was serious, yet gentle. "Grace, there's something I need to tell you." He paused, gathering his words. "I am not just a visitor here. I'm the son of a billionaire. My family owns a company far bigger than this market, far bigger than anything you could imagine. Grace froze, eyes wide, fingers gripping her basket tightly. Her mind raced. The boy she had been talking to, the one she had grown to trust, was someone from a completely different world. I don't know what to say, she whispered, voice trembling. Daniel reached out, just enough to reassure her. I don't want you to be afraid. I came here because I wanted to know you, for who you are, not for anything else. I've watched your courage, your heart, your kindness. That's why I care about you, Grace. Tears formed in Grace's eyes, and she looked down at the dusty ground. I never expected someone like you to even notice me. Daniel smiled, eyes soft, filled with admiration. You are extraordinary, Grace, and I want the world to see that too, but more than anything, I want to be with you. Grace's heart raced, emotions swirling, fear, disbelief, hope, and joy. She glanced at the corner of the market, seeing the subtle shadows of her stepmother glaring in the distance, plotting silently. But for once, Grace felt safe, seen, and valued. I don't know if I'm ready for this, she whispered, voice trembling. Daniel took a step closer. You don't have to be. I'll be here. I'll wait. I'll protect you. But I had to tell you, because you deserve honesty, Grace, and you deserve happiness. In that quiet corner of the bustling market, their hands finally met, fingers entwining naturally. The world faded, the shouting vendors, dusty streets, even the looming presence of the stepmother. There was only Grace and Daniel, bound by courage, love, and destiny. Later that evening, Daniel introduced Grace to his family. His father, a stern yet kind man, looked at Grace carefully, noting her poise, humility, and courage. By the end of the day, Daniel and Grace were officially promised to each other, a union forged not by wealth or status, but by bravery, love, and heart. The villagers, once whispering and doubtful, now marveled at Grace's transformation. From a humble, hard-working girl overlooked and mistreated, she had become someone cherished, admired, and deeply loved. And as the sun set over the village, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Grace realized that her life had changed forever. No longer just the orphaned girl enduring cruelty, she had found courage, love, and a future beyond her wildest dreams. Her journey had been long, filled with pain, struggle, and suspense, but in the end, love and bravery had triumphed.
Dear viewers, what lesson did you take away from this dramatic tale? We'd love to hear from your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest updates. Thanks for watching and stay blessed.